Corruption isn't the system malfunctioning, it's the system performing exactly as designed. That single idea is unsettling, almost challenging, because it forces us to rethink everything we've been taught about government, leadership, and accountability. We've spent decades believing corruption is a glitch, an accident created by a few greedy officials who slipped through the cracks. But what if the cracks were built intentionally? What if the weakness isn't in the people, but in the architecture itself? And what if exposing that truth doesn't just reveal a problem, but exposes an entire business model hidden in plain sight? In the next few minutes, we're stepping into a world that most people sense but can't fully explain. A world where budgets are approved with smiles but drained with silence. Where laws that seem protective are written with loopholes big enough to drive $1 billion contract through. Where corruption doesn't sneak in the back door, it walks right through the front, escorted by the very people meant to stop it. Today, we're not chasing scandals, we're tracing a pattern that repeats across continents, across parties, across ideologies, almost like it was engineered. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why corruption keeps winning, why reforms keep failing, and why the system looks broken but somehow functions exactly the same, year after year. And you'll see why that's no coincidence. Because this story isn't about individual villains, it's about a world where corruption is more profitable than honesty, more sustainable than transparency, and more powerful than democracy itself. Look around. Every missing highway, every collapsed bridge, every underfunded school, every inflated bill, none of it is random. These aren't isolated failures. They are symptoms of a deeper logic. A quiet, calculated logic that rewards theft, punishes integrity, and turns public funds into private opportunity. And the people paying the price aren't the ones writing the rules. They're the taxpayers who play by them. They're the families living with the consequences, crumbling infrastructure, rising prices, failing services, empty promises. Ordinary citizens who believe the system is supposed to protect them, not exploit them. This investigation starts with a question most governments hope you never ask. What if corruption isn't something they're trying to eliminate? What if it's something they rely on? Imagine a political machine that needs money to survive, campaigns to fund, alliances to maintain, favors to trade, power to secure. Now imagine trying to finance all of that cleanly, legally, transparently. It's impossible. No political empire survives on honesty alone. So the system quietly bends. It creates spaces where money can move without accountability, where oversight is symbolic, where complexity becomes a shield. It creates a marketplace where influence is currency and public funds become the fuel that keeps the machine running. And once those structures exist, corruption doesn't appear as chaos, it appears as strategy. In this documentary, we're going to peel back the layers of that strategy. We'll examine how corruption starts, how it scales, how it becomes normalized, and finally, how it transforms into a dependency. Because the truth is harsh but undeniable, corruption doesn't persist because it's unstoppable. It persists because too many powerful people need it to survive. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. Everything, every scandal, every budget, every missing dollar suddenly makes sense. So as we begin this story, understand one thing. Corruption isn't an accident in the system. It's the business model that keeps it alive. We've been taught a comforting lie, a lie repeated in press conferences, political speeches, and official statements every time a scandal breaks. The lie goes like this. The system is good, but a few bad apples slipped through. A dishonest official, a corrupt contractor, a greedy bureaucrat, someone who betrayed the trust placed in them, someone who acted alone, someone easily removed, replaced, forgotten. But if that story were true, corruption would be rare. It would disappear when the culprit is caught. It would fade after a resignation, a trial, a public apology. Yet somehow, the same stories keep returning, just with different faces. Corruption doesn't repeat itself because individuals fail. It repeats because systems allow the same failure to happen again and again. And when you dig deeper, you realize something unsettling. The bad apple narrative isn't meant to explain corruption. It's meant to distract from where it really lives. It redirects blame downward instead of upward. It turns systemic design flaws into personal moral failures. And it keeps the public calm, believing the threat has been removed, when in reality nothing has changed. Governments love the bad apple story because it protects the barrel. It keeps citizens from asking why the same scandals appear every election cycle, every administration, every decade. It prevents people from noticing patterns of budgets disappearing, construction projects abandoned, contracts awarded to friends, relatives, donors. If the problem were truly a handful of individuals, those patterns would break. But they don't. They never do. The names change, the titles change, the departments shift, yet corruption survives like a permanent institution. Think about the last major scandal you heard about, a fraud investigation, a misused fund, an inflated contract. The response almost always sounds the same. This does not represent who we are. This was the action of one individual. The system worked. We found the problem. But did it? If the system worked, why did it happen again? Why was the loophole there? Why was the oversight weak? Why was the money so easy to move, hide, or misreport? These questions are never answered. Because answering them would expose the truth. Corruption isn't thriving because people are clever. It's thriving because systems are built with vulnerabilities that everyone pretends are invisible. And this is where the myth becomes dangerous. When corruption is blamed on individuals, the solution becomes removing individuals. You fire someone. You make them resign. Maybe there's a trial. Maybe there's a headline. And then everyone moves on. But you never fix the mechanism that made the theft possible. You never rewrite the rules. You never close the loophole. You never redesign the oversight. And so another person steps in, discovers the same opportunities, and follows the same path. The system doesn't change, only the actors do. It's easier for governments to sacrifice one person than to admit the entire structure rewards corruption. It's easier to call someone a rogue official than to admit the incentives inside the institution push people toward dishonest behavior. It's easier to point to a villain than to confront a culture built around silence, complicity, and profit. And while the public focuses on one face, the machinery behind that face keeps turning. But the truth becomes clearer when you look beyond a single country. You see the same excuses repeated in nations with completely different political ideologies, cultures, and histories. That's the clue. If corruption were only about bad people, it wouldn't follow identical patterns across the world. Yet it does. Budgets inflated by billions. Infrastructure projects that never reach completion, procurement processes filled with friendly contractors, oversight offices underfunded by design. The pattern is global because the incentives are global, and those incentives don't rely on morality, they rely on opportunity. And here's the deeper truth. Bad apples don't create corrupt systems. Corrupt systems create bad apples. They don't attract the wrong people, they transform the people inside them. They pressure, they reward, they punish. They shape behavior through hidden incentives. And over time, what was once a rare moral failure becomes a standard operating procedure. The myth of the bad apple is comforting. It lets us believe corruption is accidental, temporary, manageable. But once you strip that myth away, you see the real picture. Corruption persists, not because individuals are flawed, but because the barrel itself is designed to protect the rot. And until we stop blaming people and start examining the system, the cycle will never end. There's a moment in every corruption investigation where you stop asking who broke the rules and you start asking who wrote them. Because the deeper you go, the more you realize something unsettling. The most devastating corruption doesn't come from violations. It comes from design. It comes from rules that look legitimate on paper but are intentionally crafted with gaps wide enough to hide an entire embezzlement scheme. The public is told those gaps are accidental. But accidents don't repeat themselves so perfectly across agencies, across administrations, across decades. Most people imagine laws and regulations are created to protect them, safeguards that make theft harder, not easier. But sit in a legislative chamber long enough and you'll see how the game is really played. A single sentence added late at night. A single phrase, subject to availability, as deemed necessary, provisional authority, that gives someone unlimited discretion. A budget line written so vaguely that it can be stretched, manipulated, or diverted without raising alarms. Nobody screams, nobody objects, because the language sounds technical and harmless. But the ambiguity is intentional. Ambiguity is the birthplace of corruption. People assume corruption requires secrecy, but in reality, some of the boldest theft happens right out in the open, buried inside hundreds of pages of legal text the public will never read. A contractor doesn't need to bribe anyone if the rules already allow inflated bidding. An agency doesn't need to hide funds if the budget is written without a clear spending cap. A politician doesn't need to break the law if the law quietly gives them the leverage they want. And when accountability disappears into the fine print, corruption isn't just possible, it becomes inevitable. You see it in procurement laws designed to increase efficiency, laws that quietly remove oversight committees or reduce the review period for major contracts. You see it in regulations that give ministers discretionary powers, a phrase that sounds official but effectively means unchecked authority with public money. You see it in policies that outsource public services to private companies without requiring transparent reporting. All of these choices are defended as reforms, yet somehow each reform ends with the same result: more power in fewer hands, and less accountability for the money flowing through them. This is the hidden art of structural corruption. You don't need secret meetings when you can alter a definition. You don't need a backroom deal when you can shift one word in a contract from must to may. You don't need threats when the system already rewards silence and punishes anyone who demands clarity. Corruption thrives in the shadows. Yes, but it thrives even more in the gray areas where legality and illegality blur so perfectly that you can't tell the difference. And when loopholes are built into the foundation, corruption becomes a feature, not an accident. A politician can claim innocence because they followed the rules. A contractor can justify inflated costs because the paperwork allowed it. A bureaucrat can escape consequences because the regulations were open to interpretation. Everything illegal becomes legal once the rulebook is rewritten to fit the crime. Governments often defend these loopholes by calling them flexibility. They insist agencies need room to adapt, to respond quickly, to act without delays. But flexibility without oversight is just permission to bend the system until the bending becomes normalized. And once these permissive structures are embedded, they're almost impossible to remove. Why? Because the people benefiting from them are the same people with the power to protect them. Think of how many financial scandals began not with someone breaking the law, but with someone using it exactly as written. They exploited a loophole that was supposedly unintended, except the same loophole had existed for years, untouched, uncorrected, defended by every administration. That's not coincidence, that's design. And here's the most revealing sign of all. Whenever a rule is finally exposed as corrupt, governments respond with shock. We had no idea. Yet they never explain who authored that rule. They never name the person who inserted the vague language. They never identify the lobbyist who pushed for the wording. They blame the exploiter, not the architect, and the architect walks away untouched, ready to draft the next loophole. The rules aren't broken. They're built to be broken. And as long as they're written this way, corruption doesn't need back doors. It walks through the front door, welcomed by the very laws meant to stop it. If you truly want to understand corruption, don't follow the scandals. Follow the incentives. Headlines show you the crime. Incentives show you the engine that makes the crime inevitable, because people do what they're rewarded for. And when a system rewards dishonesty with power, money, and protection, and punishes honesty with isolation, career destruction, or even physical danger, you don't need to guess which behavior will dominate. Corruption doesn't survive because individuals wake up one day wanting to break the law. It survives because the system quietly teaches them that playing fair is the most dangerous choice they can make. Think of an official who tries to blow the whistle. They are celebrated by the public for a moment, but inside the system, they're treated like a threat. Their promotion disappears. Their colleagues avoid them. Their superiors reassign them to meaningless departments, far from any influence. In extreme cases, they're threatened, audited, or silenced. The message spreads quickly. Integrity is expensive. Silence is safe. Meanwhile, the people who bend rules, who go along with questionable orders, who deliver favors without asking questions, those are the ones whose careers rise. They earn trust from the very people benefiting from corruption. They get invited to closed-door meetings, fast-tracked through the ranks, rewarded with perks, positions, and promises. The system doesn't reward moral courage. It rewards obedience to the unwritten rules. And over time, the moral center of an institution shifts, replacing principled people with loyal ones. This isn't just theory, it's visible everywhere. Look at campaign finance, perhaps the purest example of incentives driving corruption. A politician who refuses corporate money is praised for integrity and loses the election. They lose because they can't match the funding, the advertising, the machine. The system effectively says you can be honest or you can win, but not both. And when winning requires money, and money comes from people who want influence, the line between democracy and bribery blurs until it disappears. In many countries, running for office requires millions of dollars, millions that no ordinary citizen can raise ethically. So candidates seek supporters, donors, partners, all euphemisms for people who expect something in return. Once elected, the politician doesn't return favors because they're corrupt. They return favors because their political survival depends on it. This is the incentive structure. Power requires money. Money requires favors. Favors create the backbone of corruption. Inside the government itself, incentives go even deeper. A bureaucrat who delays a permit can extract a bribe. A contractor who inflates a project cost can share the profits with officials who approved it. A department head who allocates resources strategically can secure political alliances. These aren't random abuses. They are functions of a system where oversight is weak, accountability is selective, and personal gain outweighs public duty. Even the structure of salaries plays a role. When public officials are paid poorly, they face an unspoken pressure, survive on principles or survive on side income. And the system once again nudges them towards survival. Low wages create hunger. Hunger creates opportunity. Opportunity creates corruption. And when everyone around them is participating, refusing becomes an act of rebellion. But the most powerful incentive isn't money, it's protection. Corruption thrives when people know they won't face consequences. If you steal and the worst punishment is a brief suspension, why stop? If you mismanage millions and your only penalty is being transferred to another department, why fear? If you abuse power and the system shields you because exposing you would expose everyone else, the incentive is clear. Keep playing the game. Yet the reverse incentive is even more devastating. If you refuse to participate in corruption, you become a liability to everyone who does. Suddenly, you're not just an outsider, you're a threat. People who fear exposure will isolate you, undermine you, or push you out. The incentive to remain silent becomes stronger than the incentive to stay clean. Corruption grows stronger not because crimes are hidden, but because those who benefit from them are protected. And once protection becomes part of the culture, corruption becomes self-sustaining. A cycle where incentives align perfectly with dishonesty and completely against integrity. So when a scandal breaks and the media asks, how could this happen? The real question is, why wouldn't it? In a system where dishonesty is rewarded and honesty is punished, corruption isn't shocking. It's predictable. Every action, every decision, every betrayal traces back to the same truth. People follow incentives. And in a corrupt system, the incentives point in one direction only, deeper into the corruption itself. There comes a point in every corrupt system where theft stops being shocking. It stops being a scandal. It stops being a secret whispered in hallways. It becomes routine, predictable, expected. It becomes the way business is done, the way deals are made, the way power moves. And when corruption reaches that stage, it no longer needs hidden rooms or midnight meetings. It operates in daylight, embedded deep inside ordinary processes that most people never notice. This is the machinery of normalized theft, an entire ecosystem built to extract public money while appearing completely legitimate. At the heart of this machinery are procurement systems, the pipelines through which governments spend billions. Procurement is supposed to be slow, cautious, transparent, but corruption thrives in places where urgency replaces oversight. Emergency contracts, fast-track approvals, strategic partnerships, all of them marketed as efficiency, yet designed to bypass accountability. A project that should cost $2 million quietly becomes $10 million. A contractor with no experience somehow wins the contract over more qualified competitors. A deadline is extended, a requirement is waived, a document is lost. Each step looks procedural, but together they form a funnel directing public funds into private pockets. And all of this happens without anyone technically breaking the rules. The paperwork is immaculate, the signatures are valid. The language in the contract is precise. That's the brilliance of normalized theft. It hides behind the illusion of professionalism. Corrupt systems don't need chaos. They need structure. A structure that looks legitimate but is designed to produce illegitimate outcomes. One of the most common tools in this machinery is the revolving door, the seamless movement of individuals between government positions and private companies that benefit from government contracts. An official approves a large deal for a corporation, and months later they suddenly resign and join that corporation with a comfortable salary. It's not bribery in the traditional sense. It's strategic career planning, a reward disguised as an opportunity, a payment delivered slowly instead of in cash. And because this pattern is common, nobody questions it anymore. It's just how the game works. Then there are the advisory committees, groups of consultants hired to shape public policy. Their job is supposed to be objective analysis. But when those same consultants also work for companies that profit from the policies they help draft, the conflict of interest becomes a feature, not a flaw. They write the rules, guide the decisions, recommend the contracts, and their clients reap the rewards. The government gets to claim it followed expert advice. The experts get paid twice. The public gets nothing. Inside institutions, the normalization goes deeper. A new employee enters a department filled with unwritten expectations. They see colleagues cutting corners, signing approvals without verification, communicating through private channels, making decisions that everyone understands but nobody documents. At first they hesitate, they question, but the hesitation becomes a burden. The questioning becomes a threat, so they adapt, they blend in, they become part of the machinery, and once they do, corruption stops being morally wrong and becomes professionally necessary. That's how the cycle maintains itself, from culture to routine, from routine to policy, from policy to tradition. Corruption becomes inherited, passed down, preserved. Over time, even the public becomes desensitized. When a new scandal breaks, people shrug. That's just how politicians are. That's how government works. The outrage fades faster. The shock disappears. Society quietly accepts the theft as an unavoidable tax, an extra cost of living under flawed leadership. And when citizens stop believing change is possible, corruption becomes unbeatable. But the machinery doesn't stop at desensitization. It relies on it. A system built on normalized theft requires silence. It requires cynicism. It requires people to believe nothing can change, because silence protects the thieves more than loyalty ever could. And the most disturbing part, at this stage, corruption doesn't even need intent from every participant. The system becomes so automated that even honest people get swept into processes that lead to dishonest outcomes. It's the machine that does the work. The individuals simply keep it running because that's what the system demands for survival. Normalized theft isn't a breakdown of governance. It's governance repurposed for extraction. And once a system evolves to this point, corruption stops being a risk and becomes the operating system itself. The corruption is often described as a local disease, something rooted in culture, politics, incompetence, or a particular country's leadership. But once you step back and follow the money, you see the truth. Corruption is not a local sickness. It's a global industry. A finely tuned network of banks, corporations, consultants, and offshore havens that turn stolen public funds into protected private assets. This isn't chaos, it's a marketplace, and the world's most powerful institutions are not just bystanders, they're participants. A corrupt official in one country cannot hide millions without help. They need a bank willing to ignore suspicious transfers. They need lawyers who specialize in anonymity. They need accountants who know how to break down money into invisible pieces. They need consultants who can create shell companies in jurisdictions that ask no questions. Alone, they are just a thief. But with global systems at their disposal, they become untouchable. This is where offshore financial centers enter the picture, small territories with big protections, places with beach views, tiny populations, and laws specifically written to shield money from scrutiny. These havens pride themselves on privacy, promise secrecy. They offer structures so complex that tracing ownership becomes nearly impossible. Billions in public funds meant for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure disappear into these financial black holes every year. And once the money enters, it rarely returns. But offshore havens are only one side of the industry. The other side lives in plain sight, in major financial capitals celebrated for stability and prestige. Cities with skyscrapers full of firms whose entire business model revolves around helping wealthy clients navigate, exploit, and weaponize financial systems. These firms don't break laws. They design strategies that make the law irrelevant. They create trusts, layered corporations, nominee accounts, interlinked subsidiaries, structures that allow money to move effortlessly across borders, all while staying invisible. And they do this without shame. It's not a conspiracy, it's a service. A premium product sold to anyone who can afford it. Oligarchs, politicians, corporations, even criminal networks. If you have money, the system will protect it, no questions asked. Corruption becomes global when domestic institutions face international allies they cannot fight. Imagine an oversight agency in a struggling country trying to trace stolen funds routed through 4 shell companies, each registered under a different legal system. By the time investigators reach the first company, the trail has already shifted. The system is designed to outrun accountability. And private corporations play a crucial role too. A multinational company enters a foreign country promising development and jobs. Behind the scenes, it pays consultation fees, expedited service charges, or informal facilitation payments to secure contracts. The terms are all crafted to sound legitimate, but the outcomes are always the same: inflated projects, low-quality work, and profits that disappear offshore. The corporation walks away with millions. The government gets a headline. The public gets another unfinished project. Even international organizations, unintentionally or otherwise, reinforce this machinery. Huge aid packages are announced with pride, but the disbursement channels pass through layers of contractors, NGOs, and administrative bodies. Everyone takes a cut. Little reaches the people who actually need it, and when funds go missing, more money is sent to fix the problem. Corruption becomes a cycle funded by global good intentions. Meanwhile, global banks play their own subtle role. They are required by law to monitor suspicious activity. Yet time and time again, they are caught allowing corrupt money to pass through their systems. Penalties are issued, fines are paid. But the profits made from moving billions are larger than the fines themselves. For these institutions, corruption isn't a threat, it's revenue. And the most revealing truth is this: corrupt money is welcomed everywhere except where it came from. The countries that suffer the theft are the least equipped to protect themselves. But the countries that receive the stolen money, wealthy nations with strong laws and powerful regulators, rarely prosecute the people behind it, because the money once cleaned becomes part of their economy. That is the global industry of corruption, a world where the powerful steal without consequences, where institutions enable the theft, and where the system is too interconnected and too profitable to dismantle. Corruption doesn't survive because of local failure. It survives because the world built a marketplace for it. For every dollar stolen at the top, there is someone at the bottom who pays for it. That is the cruel mathematics of corruption. Money doesn't vanish. It shifts. It moves from hospitals that never get built to offshore accounts that never get taxed. It moves from teachers who should be paid to contractors who inflate their invoices. It moves from the pockets of ordinary families into the pockets of people who will never know what struggle feels like. And the tragedy is that the people suffering the consequences are the ones who had no part in the crime. Most citizens don't see corruption directly. They don't witness the bribe being exchanged, the deal being signed, the contract being manipulated. What they see is the outcome: the empty building, the unfinished road, the clinic without medicine, the school without electricity. They see their taxes rise and their services collapse. They see prices go up while quality goes down. They hear endless promises in election speeches, but none of those promises materialize. And even when they complain, the answers are always the same. We don't have enough funds. The budget is tight. We are doing our best. But the truth is harsher. The funds were there. They were just redirected. They were siphoned, diverted, camouflaged in paperwork, or transferred to accounts that citizens will never see. And by the time the impact reaches the public, the trail is already cold. Take infrastructure, for example. Corruption doesn't just mean a bridge costs more than it should. It means the bridge is weaker than it should be. It means maintenance is delayed. It means a structure that was supposed to last 50 years begins to crumble in 10. It means accidents that claim lives People hear about structural failures, but they never hear the real cause. Someone decided their profit mattered more than someone else's safety. Or consider healthcare. A corrupted system doesn't simply overspend, it underdelivers. Medicines run out not because the country can't afford them, but because funds were misused. Hospitals become overcrowded not because demand increased, but because expansion budgets were absorbed by middlemen. Doctors work with outdated equipment because procurement deals were designed to enrich suppliers, not patients. And in moments of crisis, pandemics, disasters, emergencies, the cracks widen into tragedies. Education suffers in the same pattern. Schools remain underfunded while education budgets grow every year. Money intended for textbooks ends up in the hands of contractors who never deliver. Teacher salaries stagnate while administrative costs mysteriously rise. Students sit in classrooms with leaking roofs, broken desks, and no technology, while politicians cut ribbons at extravagant ceremonies celebrating progress. And the heaviest burden falls on the poor, not because they are targeted, but because they have no cushion, no protection, no voice strong enough to push back. When corruption inflates prices, the rich complain quietly while the poor skip meals. When corruption destroys public services, the wealthy switch to private alternatives while the poor are left with nothing. Corruption turns inequality into a permanent structure, one where the gap widens every year, but the excuses stay the same. Even everyday life becomes harder. Corruption fuels inflation by distorting markets. It reduces wages by draining economic growth. It increases taxes because governments try to recover what was stolen by squeezing those who still follow the rules. It creates a culture of hopelessness, where people begin to believe nothing will ever change, where cynicism replaces trust, and where citizens distance themselves from the institutions meant to represent them. That loss of trust is one of corruption's deepest wounds. When citizens stop believing in their government, democracy weakens. Voting feels pointless. Activism feels futile. The idea of a fair society becomes a fantasy. And this is where corruption becomes more than theft. It becomes a psychological weapon, a tool that convinces entire populations that honesty is naive, that justice is imaginary, that fairness is impossible. And while the public carries this invisible weight, the architects of corruption live comfortably outside its impact. Their children attend the best schools, their families receive the best medical care, their homes sit behind gates and guards. They will never stand in line for a broken public service. They will never feel the consequences of the decisions they made. The pain is outsourced to the people who trusted them. In the end, corruption doesn't just steal money. It steals stability. It steals opportunity. It steals futures. And the silent victims, the citizens who wake up every day hoping for a better life, are left paying a debt they never agreed to for crimes they never committed. If governments truly wanted to eliminate corruption, they would have done it decades ago. They have the laws, the resources, the intelligence, and the authority. They have investigative bodies, audit departments, ethics committees, public accounts offices, transparency units, and entire ministries dedicated to good governance. Yet corruption not only survives, it grows, it adapts, it becomes more sophisticated. And every time a new anti-corruption initiative is announced with confidence and applause, the public eventually discovers the same truth. Nothing changed. Nothing ever changes, because the efforts are designed to fail. Anti-corruption campaigns often begin with dramatic speeches. Leaders promise zero tolerance. They condemn the corrupt. They speak about restoring trust, rebuilding institutions, protecting taxpayers, but behind closed doors, those same leaders know something the public doesn't. Real reform threatens the very networks they rely on. Real reform means cutting off the financial pipelines that fund political power. Real reform means exposing allies, donors, insiders, people too important to sacrifice. So instead of reform, they create performance, a show, a political theater meant to calm citizens while protecting the system. This is why anti-corruption bodies are almost always weak by design. Their budgets are limited. Their powers are restricted. Their appointments are political. Their investigations require approval from the very officials they are supposed to monitor. The result is predictable. They catch small offenders, low-level bureaucrats, and scapegoats who are easy to replace, but they never touch the architects, never the high-ranking officials, never the true beneficiaries. These agencies are not shields for the public, they are shields for the elite. And when these agencies do attempt real work, they face strategic obstacles. Their requests for information are delayed, their warrants are denied. Their reports are edited, softened, or buried. Internal whistleblowers are punished, demoted, or quietly dismissed. Investigations stall until the media loses interest. By the time the truth emerges, it's diluted, fragmented, or overshadowed by a new scandal. Corruption survives not despite these agencies, but because of them. Then there are the so-called reforms. Governments proudly announce new laws, new committees, new oversight mechanisms. But these reforms are often crafted to sound impressive while being practically useless. They include vague language, weak enforcement clauses, or exemptions that protect powerful actors. They create more bureaucratic layers that slow down transparency rather than strengthen it. In many cases, reforms are explicitly designed to redirect blame, to give the illusion that the government acted, while ensuring nothing meaningful changes. Another tactic is selective prosecution. Governments choose one high-profile target, expose them dramatically, ensure the case receives maximum media coverage, and use that single case as proof that the system is working. But in reality, the prosecution is strategic. It punishes someone who became inconvenient, someone who lost political favor, someone who threatened the hierarchy. Selective prosecution sends a message. Corruption is allowed, but only if you stay loyal to the right people. International pressure doesn't help either. When global organizations demand accountability, governments respond with showy compliance, signing agreements, forming task forces, holding summits. But these initiatives rarely produce results because they lack teeth. They don't dismantle structures. They don't enforce accountability. They operate on trust while corruption operates on survival. And yet, the most powerful reason anti-corruption efforts fail lies deeper. Corruption is profitable. It funds campaigns. It finances alliances. It keeps political machines running. It buys silence. It buys loyalty. It keeps powerful people powerful. And no government willingly destroys the very system that sustains its authority. So instead, they manage corruption, contain it, shape it, use it strategically. They tolerate acceptable levels of theft as long as it doesn't spark rebellion. They allow networks to operate freely until they become a threat. And they ensure the public never sees the full picture, only fragments, scapegoats, and distractions. That is why corruption keeps returning like a recurring illness that no treatment ever cures, because the treatments are not real. They are designed to relieve symptoms, not eliminate the disease, to protect appearances, not accountability, to maintain power, not justice. And as long as anti-corruption remains a performance instead of a priority, the cycle will continue. The same scandals, the same promises, the same failures. A system pretending to correct itself while ensuring nothing ever truly changes. There is a moment in every collapsing institution when corruption stops being a crime and becomes a necessity, a fuel, a currency, a stabilizing force that keeps the machine running. It's the point where corruption shifts from being a side effect to being the business model itself. By this stage, the system no longer merely tolerates corruption, it depends on it, it leans on it, it draws power from it. Without corruption, the entire structure would fall apart. To understand this transformation, you have to look at how political power is maintained. Elections cost money, campaigns cost money. Alliances cost money, silence costs money, loyalty costs money. None of these needs can be met with official salaries, legal donations, or transparent funding. So politicians build alternative pipelines, streams of money that flow quietly, reliably, and off the record. These pipelines are fueled by inflated contracts, padded budgets, shady partnerships, and networks of businessmen who know exactly what role they play in the hierarchy. In a corrupt system, every relationship becomes transactional. A contractor doesn't win a project because they are the best. They win because they pay the highest tribute. A bureaucrat doesn't rise through merit. They rise through obedience and usefulness to the network. A politician doesn't protect someone because they care. They protect them because they owe a favor, because that person funded their campaign, because exposing them would expose everyone. Once corruption becomes the business model, every decision has two layers, the public explanation and the private calculation. A public project is approved not because it benefits the people, but because it benefits the system's financial ecosystem. A regulation is passed not to ensure fairness, but to create a new revenue stream for insiders. A reform is introduced not to improve governance, but to redirect money flow toward the faction currently in power. And in this environment, honesty becomes a threat. A genuinely transparent official doesn't just disrupt corruption, they disrupt the financial architecture that keeps the political machine stable. They risk drying up the funds that sustain campaigns, buy loyalty, and maintain order. So the system reacts like an immune response. It isolates them, weakens them, removes them, because the system cannot function if its business model is interrupted. This is also the stage where corruption becomes self-sustaining. It no longer requires overt planning or secret meetings. The incentives are so deeply built into the workflow that corruption happens automatically. Every agency develops its own version of the model. Every department creates its own revenue streams. Every official knows their role. The machine learns to feed itself. At this point, corruption becomes predictable. Budgets are inflated as a matter of tradition. Projects are announced with the expectation of kickbacks. Contracts are written with the understanding that everyone gets a cut. Public resources are treated as communal spoils for the political class, not as assets belonging to the nation. Theft stops being a scandal and becomes an operating cost. Even the economy begins to adjust. Entire sectors of business emerge for the sole purpose of servicing corruption. Shell companies, middlemen, consultants, lobbying firms, offshore agents, accountants who specialize in tan-colored money, neither white nor black, just hidden. Jobs depend on corruption. Industries depend on corruption. Political alliances depend on corruption. Removing it would collapse the entire informal economy built around it. And here lies the most disturbing truth. The system eventually becomes addicted to corruption. It needs constant inflows of illicit money to function. When those inflows slow down, the system enters crisis. Political tensions rise, alliances fracture, leaders scramble to find new sources of revenue. Corruption becomes a survival mechanism, not just for officials, but for the entire governing structure. By this stage, corruption is no longer a behavior, it's an institution. It has its own logic, its own rules, its own incentives. And the people inside the system follow those rules not because they are evil, but because the system leaves them no alternative. Once corruption becomes the business model, honesty becomes not just unrealistic, but impossible. This is the final evolution of a captured state, where accountability is the enemy, truth is the threat, and corruption is the glue holding everything together. Here is the truth everything has been leading to, the part most governments will never admit, the part most citizens never fully see, the part that changes how you understand every scandal, every budget, every promise. Corruption doesn't survive because the system is weak. It survives because the system is built to sustain it, because too many powerful people rely on it, because without corruption, the political and economic structure that controls a nation would lose its fuel, its leverage, its loyalties, and its ability to keep itself standing. The shocking reality is this: corruption is not the malfunction of the system, it is the system's operating logic. When you strip away the speeches, the committees, the audits, the statements of shock and concern, what remains is a political economy engineered around extraction. Corruption funds campaigns. Corruption secures alliances. Corruption keeps bureaucratic networks loyal. Corruption buys silence. Corruption creates dependency. The system is not trying to stop corruption. It's trying to manage it, to channel it, to make sure it flows in the right direction, to the right people in the right amounts. This is why every major scandal looks familiar, because it is familiar. The players change, but the pattern never does. The inflated budget, the vague legislation, the rigged procurement, the offshore transfer, the silent beneficiaries, the scapegoat offered to the public, the investigation that leads nowhere. The cycle resets and the machine keeps running, unfazed. And here's the final revelation. Corruption isn't just tolerated, it is strategically engineered. The loopholes in laws aren't sloppy mistakes. They are deliberate openings. The weak oversight isn't accidental. It's intentional protection. The revolving door isn't a coincidence. It's a reward system. The selective enforcement isn't justice. It's control. Powerful networks need corruption because it gives them something transparency cannot: untraceable money, unaccountable influence, and unquestioned loyalty. In a clean system, leaders would have to earn public trust. They would have to rely on genuine merit, real results, and accountable governance. But in a corrupted system, trust becomes irrelevant, results become optional, accountability becomes impossible, money, not integrity, becomes the backbone of power. And once this dependency forms, the entire structure, political, financial, bureaucratic, becomes trapped in a cycle it cannot escape. If corruption stops, the alliances collapse, the funding dries up, the protection disappears, the machine falls apart. That is the ultimate truth. Corruption is not the enemy of the modern political system. It is the glue holding its internal architecture together. This is why real reform never comes, why honest leaders get swallowed, why anti-corruption efforts fail, why citizens keep paying for crimes they didn't commit. Because the system isn't built on public service. It's built on hidden exchanges, and corruption is the hidden currency. Once you understand this, everything finally makes sense. Every missing dollar, every unfinished project, every scandal that fades before the truth arrives. Corruption is not the bug, it's the business model. And everyone inside the system already knows it. In the end, when you step back and look at the full picture, a painful but undeniable truth emerges. Corruption isn't an occasional disruption of public life, it's the silent architect shaping it. It determines which projects get built and which promises stay empty. It decides who gains power, who keeps it, and who gets crushed for standing in the way. For decades, people believed corruption was a temporary illness, a flaw that strong leadership or better laws could cure. But now you've seen how deep the roots go, how corruption becomes culture, then strategy, then survival. And once a system learns to depend on it, honesty becomes more dangerous than dishonesty. What makes this story tragic is that the victims are never the ones in the room when the deals are made. They are the families struggling with broken infrastructure, the workers trapped by rising costs, the students learning in neglected schools, the patients waiting for care that never arrives. They carry the weight of decisions made in boardrooms and backrooms, decisions they never agreed to but pay for every day. And yet understanding this pattern is the first step toward breaking it. Because corruption thrives in confusion, in the belief that nothing makes sense and nothing can change. But everything does make sense once you see the design. Every missing dollar leaves a trail. Every loophole has an author. Every scandal follows the same logic. And once a society recognizes the pattern, it can finally start demanding more than speeches, more than headlines, more than symbolic reform. Recognizing the design is the beginning of resisting it. And in the end, when all the layers are peeled back, a single truth remains. Corruption was never the flaw in the system. It was the foundation holding it together. Every scandal, every loophole, Every missing dollar points back to a structure built to protect itself, not the people it governs. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The pattern was never accidental, it was engineered, and it's still running exactly as designed. If you found this eye-opening, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. Tell us in the comments which stage shocked you the most, and stay connected because more deep investigations like this are on the way.